Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to the Grand Canyon Baha'i Conference for having invited me. I will begin with a prayer from Abdul Baha, which appears on the tombstone of my grandmother, Zuhuriya, which says, "Behold the candle, how it gives forth its light. It weeps its life away, drop by drop, so that it may give forth its flame of light." We chose that poem because my grandmother, Zuhuriya, was the embodiment of selflessness and sacrifice. As a child, we learned about our history, about where we came from. My great-grandmother, Jamaliya, lived in the city of Yazd when in 1903, Muslim mobs began their pogrom against the Baha'is in Yazd, putting women, children, men to horrible deaths. Jamaliya was bearing a child and was thrown off a balcony. She was presumed dead, but she miraculously survived, so that evening her husband put her on a carriage and went straight to the border of what was then Tsarist Russia, in the city of Ashgabat. She miscarried, but she went on to live, and in 1910 gave birth to my grandmother, Zuhuriya. All of us in Iran heard stories like that. It was part of what we learned in Sunday school. It's part of what we learned about our own families and where we came from. But as children, we had other priorities. We wanted to play, we wanted to have fun. We lived in a time of great prosperity in Iran during the time of the Shah. So for us, history was something that we memorized to keep our parents happy. It was about distant events that had nothing to do with the comfortable reality that we experienced. When I was 9 years old, we left for a place called Toronto. I couldn't understand why we had to leave our beautiful life in Tehran to go to a place where I heard everybody lived in igloos. As a 9-year-old, the idea of exile, the idea of persecution, had no meaning. I lived in a world of blissful innocence. Arriving in Canada was a great culture shock. I spoke very little English. For some time in school, I thought that a thesaurus was a dinosaur who knew a lot of words. It was a great adjustment. I remember seeing color television for the first time. Back in Iran, I'd only seen John Wayne in black and white. And I remember being so surprised that in addition to Persian, John Wayne also spoke English. So there I was, adjusting to my new home in Canada. And there was a lot to learn. I was baffled at why Canadians observe traffic regulations. Back in Tehran, there was a sort of clarity to the survival of the fittest. The size of the vehicle determined who had right of way. I enjoyed the luxury shopping malls, but I couldn't understand why the cashiers refused to haggle over the price of merchandise. So there I was, the immigrant child, trying to fit in. By the time I was an adolescent, human rights, exile, persecution, these ideas were hardly my priority. My priority was disco music. Disco music was morphing into house music in those days, and it was full of angry words and expletives. And we would always play them at family gatherings and enjoy our elders who didn't speak English clapping along Some of them would even parrot the vulgar words with a heavy Persian accent. So much for my misspent youth. And then I was 16 years old, trying to fit in, trying to be cool in high school with my friends. And we hear that one of my contemporaries in Iran, same age as I, from Shiraz, by the name of Muna Mahmoud Nijad, has been arrested. Her crime was that she had written an essay in high school demanding her human rights. Now, in Canada, as a 16-year-old, if I wrote an essay about freedom of belief, about freedom of expression, I would be commended by my teachers. But in Iran, Mona would pay a very heavy price for her courage. She was put in prison. She was subject to horrific torture. And sometime in the summer of 1983, she and 9 other young Baha'i women in Shiraz were hanged. That completely destroyed my world. I already knew during those years that terrible things were happening to the Baha'is. We heard about the father of this friend who was martyred, the father of another friend who disappeared. But somehow Mona's death, because she was the same age as I was, shattered my world. And the first question I asked was, why her and not me? Why her and not me? What was the difference between Mona and I? The only difference was that my family moved to Canada and she stayed behind in Iran. I was overcome by this deep sense of rage and grief, sense of helplessness that I couldn't do anything to save her. But then it made me think, here we are in Canada, enjoying freedom. What did it mean to be free if it was wasted on selfish mediocrity? I looked at the society around me, consumerist culture that glorified greed and narcissism, that told us our self-worth as a human being depends on what we wear and what we drive and which neighborhood we live in, and all of this nonsense. And it all seemed like an empty, meaningless illusion. Mona's sacrifice brought me to a crossroads in my life where I had to choose. Am I going to turn my back on this grave injustice, or am I going to commit my life to serving humanity? And I remember hearing that her last wish, indeed, was that the youth of the world would arise and serve humankind. It's very easy to read the Baha'i writings, but it's another thing to really allow them to penetrate our being, to understand the deeper meaning of those words. They must become felt. They must be a felt experience. When we talk about sacrifice, when we talk about selflessness, do we just go about living our lives, or do we understand that the steed of the valley of love is pain? Without pain, without sacrifice, the journey will never begin. I remember reading the hidden word, "Is it thy wish to die upon thy bed, or to shed thy lifeblood in the dust, a martyr in my path?" And I decided that I was going to take it seriously. And thus began a long, eventful, and painful journey of discovering what it means to serve. A group of us had put together a music video in honor of Mona. It was called Mona with the Children. There was a Canadian artist, Doug Cameron, who you may know. And he brought on board Seals and Croft and a number of others. I thought I was going to be the good guy. I ended up as a Revolutionary Guard. It was my briefly lived career as an actor. And when I participated, together with a group of other Iranian Baha'i refugees who were all volunteers, in trying to recreate the story of Mona, to tell the world what happened to her, I remember coming across a woman named Buffy St. Marie, striking indigenous woman, a Cree from Saskatchewan. Those of you from older generations will know her, very famous performer. And I remember the recreation of the scene of Mona's hanging in a studio north of Toronto, how we were all shedding tears, reliving that moment when she kissed the noose and put it around her own neck, knowing what was going to happen to her. She was going to live her final moments with courage. And I looked and I saw Buffy shedding tears. And I was deeply touched by that. Why, I thought, would an indigenous woman from Saskatchewan be crying for a 16-year-old girl in Iran? And that taught me that those who wander on the path of redemption have a strange way of finding each other. When we are opened to suffering, then we come out of our own little bubble and we realize the transcendent reality of human suffering. We realize that oneness only has meaning when we understand that all human beings suffer the same. I wanted to know about Buffy's people. So I decided to go on a teaching trip to the Canadian Arctic in December. I remember arriving in Baker Lake, what is now called Nunavut, among the Inuits. And I asked someone, what's the temperature? And they said, it doesn't matter. It was a bone-chilling minus 48 degrees Celsius. But it was an incredible experience, coming with all that grief, with all that rage, with all that emotional distress, and sitting under the northern lights in the great vastness of the Arctic, listening to the wind, sitting in the company of the shamans who had a remarkable way of speaking through silence. I realized my insignificance in an infinite universe. It was the most liberating feeling imaginable. I returned in the summer to Baker Lake. And it was an extraordinary experience because the same place that I'd visited had gone from constant darkness to constant light. The universe was dancing with ecstatic motion where once it was all darkness. And it made me realize that in our moments of sorrow, we have to be patient. We have to have faith, because faith is only meaningful because we suffer, because we feel the agony of longing, the desire to be united with our beloved. I decided then that I was going to pursue a career in human rights. Now, as Iranians, we have three career choices: law, medicine, social disgrace. My brother chose medicine, and I chose law. Unfortunately, there was no third child. So I decided that I was going to become a human rights lawyer, and I was going to go and work for the United Nations. And all of this was because I'd been touched by the sacrifice of Mona. All of this because I asked myself, what is my life worth if I don't spend every conscious, wakeful moment that I have trying to serve? And I went with the United Nations after law school, while my friends were busy making a fortune on Wall Street. I went to Yugoslavia, I went to Rwanda, I went to all these sites of sorrow across the world where I saw unspeakable suffering. And it was very painful. There was nothing romantic about it. It was exceedingly painful to see the injustice in the world, but it was even more painful to realize how few people cared. In Rwanda, and we saw a story of one of the Baha'i friends, almost 1 million people were killed in 1994 during a 3-month period. This was a Holocaust which didn't happen in some, Nazi Hollywood film that we see about Nazi crimes. It happened in our time. It was a televised genocide. The world knew exactly what was going to happen. There were countless warnings, but no one cared. 1 million people in Africa meant nothing. Nobody lost a vote for abandoning 1 million people in Rwanda. My friend Eloge Butera, one of my students, who miraculously made it from a dirt classroom in Kigali to my law school, where I had the pleasure of teaching him, now he's my adoptive brother, was running around the streets with his mother in those days, as the United Nations had decided to abandon the Tutsis to their fate. They came to a school where 150 Belgian UN peacekeepers were stationed, hoping that they could be rescued there. They were turned away because the school was overflowing. There was no space for anyone else. Dejected, they left and hid in the bush as best as they could. He had a baby sister, and he said that even she was so terrified that she didn't cry. They thought they were going to die, but it was the best thing to happen to them, because within 48 hours, the UN troops were withdrawn. And every single one of the people that was sheltering in that school was put to death. There were people running after the UN vehicles, begging them, please don't abandon us. Eloge lost his best friend Samuel because Samuel made it to the school and Eloge did not. Today he has a beautiful boy named Samuel because he says that I wanted the world to remember the joy of my friend and the brightness of this candle. Last summer, I was in northern Iraq, in a place called Duhok, in a refugee camp among the Yazidi minority who was subject to the horrific crimes of so-called ISIS. There I met 2 sisters, Badia and Bushra, who lived in Sinjar Mountain in a small village when ISIS came and killed all of the men and boys and abducted the women and girls, reducing them to sex slaves. They were 12 and 13 at the time. They miraculously managed to escape. And there they were sitting in this refugee camp. This time it was 50 degrees Celsius, not minus, in a hellish summer in Iraq, sitting in that squalid camp with the stench of the makeshift lavatories these people who are completely traumatized, who've lost everything that they have. And then I went to a prison nearby the refugee camp. And I met a young man named Ahmed Al-Ghatib. And I will tell you who he was. But what he told me at the end of an interview that I had with him was, "I miss my mother." It's not a remarkable thing to say, except that Ahmed was a suicide bomber. He was from Syria, he'd been recruited by ISIS. He was obviously an unsuccessful suicide bomber because I could still speak with him. He had failed to detonate his bomb. He was captured by the Kurdish Peshmerga soldiers, and he was now a prisoner. And I was asking him about why he had done the things that he had done. And at first he began with the rehearsed speech with which they were all brainwashed. There is only one Allah, we must destroy the enemies of Islam, and there was a long list of enemies. And after he had finished his speech, I said, "Do you have anything else to say?" He says, "I miss my mother." He said, "I wish I could turn time back and go to school. I wanted to become a medical doctor." So I wondered what turned Ahmed the healer into Ahmed the killer. And what is the difference between him and some young kid that I would see in a shopping mall in Toronto texting his girlfriend on his iPhone, for whom the horrors of Syria and Iraq would be a Facebook post at best? One of the strange things that I experience coming from these far-off places is to come back to North America and to see that in the midst of all of our freedom, in the midst of all of our prosperity, in the midst of all of our privilege, we're going through a psychic pandemic. We're going through what is in effect a collective mental health crisis. We have probably the highest rates of stress, anxiety, and despair in the world. We have a society in which ecstasy is confused with a pill. We have a society of narcissism and greed, what The Guardian called a cancerous materialism that is eating away at our soul. And right here in our own backyard, or halfway across the world, we have these extremes of suffering, which are not unconnected with the choices that we make and the lives that we lead. When we arise and serve humankind, we're not doing anybody a favor except our own selves. By sacrificing, by giving to others, we're doing nothing more than retrieving our own authenticity. We're nobody's savior except our own. And I always realize that we can read the writings, but until we are touched by the reality of human suffering, they will not really be clothed with meaning. Until we open our hearts to experiencing the pain and suffering around us, we will never really understand the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So I'm going to, in memory of Mona, end with this poem that was inspired by Hafez from Shiraz, the blessed city where Mona drew her last breath, so that we can all rededicate our lives once we leave this great gathering and actively pursue those that suffer in the world and make sacrificial service the center of our lives, because all I can think about at this moment is that passage from the fire tablet where it says, "Shall I weep at the fewness of thy champions?" Friends, the responsibility that we have is overwhelming, and none of us, not a single one of us, has an excuse not to roll up our sleeves and dedicate everything that we have in this struggle. The poem is, after all these years, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens with a love like that. It illuminates the whole sky. Thank you.